On today's show, we will be joined by Kyle Cushman. We'll discuss the two Leafs prospects that will attend Team Canada's World Junior Selection Camp. We'll discuss some other Leafs prospects that are turning heads this year in the system, and also talk about the big club. How does Kyle like what's happening with the Toronto Maple Leafs? We'll chat about all that and more on today's edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Leafs podcast, a daily Maple Leaf-centered podcast hosted by myself, Mike DiStefano, and my co-host, Dave Morassutti. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. We got a busy, loaded show today. We are joined by Kyle Cushman, who's a Leafs analyst and prospect writer for The Score. So why don't we get right into it, Dave? Let's bring him in. It's Kyle Cushman joining us here on the Locked On Leafs podcast. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. I'm Mike DiStefano with my co-host, Dave Morassutti. And just a reminder, we're a daily Maple Leaf-centered podcast. We got shows coming out each and every weekday, Monday through Friday, wherever you can find your podcasts, also up on YouTube. If you're new to the show and you've enjoyed the content so far, we ask that you would subscribe so that you can get that new pod right to you right when it comes out. And if you're an everydayer, we appreciate you, as always. Joining us now on the show is Kyle Cushman. He's a prospect analyst and a hockey writer for The Score. And it's a perfect time to have you on, Kyle, because some pretty big prospect news came out today.
Yeah, World Junior camps are finally out. The United States yesterday, as we're recording this, Canada today, as we're recording this. Obviously, some of the international teams and stuff will trickle in over the next couple of weeks and lead up, obviously, into Boxing Day. But the big two, especially for the Maple Leafs, coming yesterday and today, given all of the World Junior eligible players Canada or the Maple Leafs have in the system, are all Canadian, which is something that we haven't really seen in the past handful of years. Recently, it's been guys like Topi Niemela and Roni Hirvonen, those kind of guys playing for Finland or Sweden, those kind of countries. But a couple of guys looking to crack Canada's camp here.
Yeah, so the two names that are named to the preliminary camp roster, Easton Cowan, who was at the time a much maligned first round pick from the Maple Leafs. People thought maybe it was a bit of a reach, and people are kind of now changing their tune on that one. And then Fraser Minten, who had a cup of coffee with Toronto earlier this year, thought maybe he could have been a 19-year-old player who could maybe find his way into the NHL, but ended up getting sent down, traded also when he got sent down to the Blades. So those are the two players that will be at Team Canada's World Junior Camp roster. Let's start with Fraser Minten, because he's a guy who at least most Leaf fans know who he is based on the terrific training camp he had and parlayed it into, what did he get into, 4 games, 3 or 4 games?
Yeah, 4 games, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how has he been since he's been sent back down, and what odds do you give Fraser Minten to make this club, and what kind of impact can he have if he does?
Yeah, you kind of alluded to it, where it's been a bit of a weird season so far for Minten, where he played well in camp enough to crack the Maple Leafs roster, which was something that nobody really expected coming into camp. He got into 4 NHL games, and then partially due to injuries and weird cap stuff, he had to get sent down maybe a little bit earlier than people were anticipating, but returned to Kamloops, who over his entire tenure with that team had been one of the top teams in the WHL, had been gearing up to hosting the Memorial Cup back in the earlier part of this season, graduated a bunch of those top players. And so when Minten returned to that team, it's a lot of a bare bone roster with a lot of young guys on that team, but not a lot of high end talent in a team that's going to be most likely in the draft lottery, not exactly the playoff picture for the WHL. So when Minten returned there, he was playing huge minutes. He was getting first line center, something that he hadn't really done to this point in his WHL career. He'd more been a second line center, third line center behind some of the top guys in Kamloops. So he was getting prime minutes, getting something like 25, 30 faceoffs a game, like insane numbers But in kind of returning to that team, being named captain as well, it was a bit of an understanding where eventually he was going to be traded. It wasn't a when, it wasn't if, it was when he was going to be traded, just because of where Kamloops was as a team. Minten only has this remaining year of junior eligibility. Then he'll be with the Marlies or with the Maple Leafs. So it didn't make sense for the Blazers to hold on to him. So he ends up getting shipped very early in the season, only playing 6 or 7 games upon returning to Kamloops, to Saskatoon, who's a team that's right at the top of the WHL, looking to make a big push for a WHL championship and actually playing alongside another Maple Leafs prospect there in Brandon Lisowski. And so it's only been a handful of games there. He's been kind of mixing in their top 6 in a couple of different ways, power play, stuff like that. But upon returning to the WHL, he didn't score a point in his first game, but he had a multi-game point streak after that, which carried into his debut with Saskatoon, and is a player that, even though he hasn't put up huge numbers upon returning to the WHL, it's not something like Matt Savoy, who has returned from the NHL and put up over 2 points per game. That's not what Minten's done. That's also not really his game. So he was somebody that, after going to summer meetings in the summer with Hockey Canada, we knew that he was somebody that, if he wasn't on the NHL roster, was very likely to be named at least to this preliminary roster. And I would be very surprised if he doesn't end up making this team. He's somebody that fits a lot of what Hockey Canada likes in a bottom 6 player, especially at the World Juniors. He's very responsible defensively, can play the wing, can play center as well, can play power play, can play penalty kill. He can play in all those situations, and somebody that's projected to be a 3rd or 4th liner for this team, that's very valuable. You can't necessarily be a one-dimensional player in a bottom 6 at an international tournament for Canada. You got to provide value in a few different ways, and that's what Minten does. So he's somebody that, given he's been at a couple of summer meetings, he's now been invited to this team, had a cup of coffee in the NHL, all of those things. I think he's somebody that's going to be an important depth piece for this team. I think he's going to be a primary penalty killer. And I think he's a very high likelihood to make this roster at a camp.
And yeah, I mean, Fraser Minten has certainly taken big steps in his development. And like Easton Cowan, I guess I think he got another 2 points tonight. Last time I saw for the London Knights, like, he's now become a goal scoring machine since he was sent down. Like, where do you see his chances with this team and making the squad and what he's done so far this year?
Yeah, so you kind of talked about it a little bit off the top, where a maligned 1st round pick, somebody that we didn't expect to be a 1st round pick, like, I think it was Sportsnet maybe that showed the difference between Connor Bedard's walk to the stage and Easton Cowan's walk to the stage in one of his preseason games.
Yeah,
a long walk for Easton Cowan, and what he's done since then is remarkable. Like, whether it's the rookie tournament or training camp or returning to London, like, everywhere he's played since he was drafted, he's been unbelievably good, and in multiple areas. He's played all forward positions for London this year. He's played a little bit of left wing. He's played a little bit of center. Currently, he's been playing right wing on their second line, as they kind of split up some of their top dogs there in London. He's played power play and been proficient there. He also leads the OHL in shorthanded goals and assists. He has something like 6 shorthanded points already through like 21 games this season. It's incredible, the stuff that he's been doing this season. And so to make Team Canada's camp here, despite being a 1st round pick, and I know the expectation is, 1st round pick, you should be on the camp roster, all that kind of stuff. It isn't a shoo-in. Like, it isn't like a foregone conclusion that a 1st round pick, as a 18-year-old as well, not a 19-year-old, makes these rosters and makes these camps. We have to see if Cowan will end up making the roster. I think he has a very good chance to do so. But you look back just last year, Matt Savoy, top 10 pick, didn't make the Team Canada roster as an 18-year-old. Connor Geekie didn't make the roster as an 18-year-old. Denton Mateychuk didn't make the roster as an 18-year-old. Like, you can go down the list. A lot of those guys last year didn't make the roster as an 18-year-old. I think there's a little bit more room to make the roster this year, just based off of who was released and who wasn't. But for a guy like Easton Cowan, like, you look at the draft, and Tanner Molendyk and everybody before him drafted that were released to this roster are on the camp roster. So that's 24th overall and up. But everybody past that until basically the end of the 2nd round, the only guys that made this camp roster out of that group are Easton Cowan and Carson Rakoff, who has been incredible this year for Kitchener in the OHL. Guys like Callum Ritchie aren't on this team that were drafted ahead of Easton Cowan. Guys like Bradley Nadeau, who's tearing up the NCAA, isn't on this roster. Nico Mijatovic, who was the top pick of the second round, not on this roster. Like, you can keep going
Quentin
down
Musty
that
too,
list.
who was
Yeah, exactly.
I
So
remember he was a big guy. Everyone's like, "Oh, gotta get Quentin Musty, gotta get Quentin Musty." And then he was
yeah,
getting there, and then he got scooped up like a pick or two before, I believe, and everyone was upset. But maybe they
yeah,
got the better player.
Musty's actually American, but he also didn't make the American roster either.
Yeah.
So a bit of a different situation there. He's been very good this year as well. But a bit of a different player where Cowan, like you mentioned it, somebody that projects to be kind of that very versatile, effective third, fourth liner, where Musty is kind of more of that top six or bust kind of guy. And when you look at what the Maple Leafs are looking for in prospects, they don't necessarily need as much of that high end talent. Obviously, when these guys crack the NHL, maybe the roster's in a bit of a different situation. But for the most part, the Leafs don't need these top six or bust guys. They need guys who can kind of play a bunch of different areas. And Easton Cowan fits that bill perfectly, the way that he's played and developed to this point. So you talk about his odds to make this roster back in June when he was drafted. I would have put it extremely low. Right now, I would say he's close to a lock to make this roster, just based off of everything that he brings to the table. Like, you look at the guys on this roster, he plays all four positions. So that's a benefit to him. Left wing, center, right wing, no matter where you need him to play, he can play. You need somebody to fill in a little bit on power play too, he can do that. You need somebody to be an anchor on the penalty kill, he can do that for you. Like, just look at the shorthanded points that he's put up this year with Denver Barkey. I think looking at who's on this roster and kind of looking at maybe a bit of a lineup projection, I think a third or fourth line where you keep that Barkey and Cowan duo together and have somebody like Owen Beck in the middle of them, that's a nightmare line for anybody to play against. That can be a shutdown line against any of the top lines in the tournament. It can be a menace for checking against any of the kind of top defense pairs as well, really wear you down on the forecheck. And they're all guys that can play big minutes on the penalty kill, chip in on the power play as well, and open up some of those more big minutes at 5-on-5 and on the power play for some of the top guys on this team. So with how proficient Cowan's been this year, his style of play, everything like that, Hockey Canada will want a couple of guys that are return eligible on this roster as well, just to kind of get that experience and have those guys able to return. I think Cowan really ticks a lot of the boxes of what Hockey Canada typically likes. His performance this year and all of that, I think he's somebody that would be a great fit on this roster. And I think he's somebody that, especially when he shows up in training camp, everything that we've seen from him so far this year, Maple Leafs training camp, he impressed. Rookie tournament, he impressed. Returning to the London Knights, he's been one of their top players. I would say their top player and one of the top players in the OHL as well. I fully expect Easton Cowan to go to this Hockey Canada camp. And if he isn't kind of in line for a roster spot already, impress the staff enough to go out and earn a roster spot. You look at the coaching staff as well. The head coach is the Sarnia Sting head coach, Alan Letang. He's somebody that has seen a lot of Easton Cowan this year, coaching against him, obviously, with Sarnia. I think he's got a really, really good shot to make this team, which, again, you look back to June when he was drafted, don't think anybody thought that this would come this quickly for him.
No. I mean, like, I'm not a prospect guy. Don't get me wrong, but I'm reading everyone's rankings and I'm, texting, all of my buddies who are prospect guys such as yourself, and I'm like, tell me about this kid. And it seemed like a lot of people didn't like it. Everyone said kind of the same thing. They're like, there's tools there. It's a little early, but like, it could work out. Kind of was what a lot of people said about Easton Cowan. And I'm curious, if you were to rewrite a scouting report today for Cowan compared to, when you wrote your final report for him, when you were doing your draft rankings back, in last June or May or whenever you finalized them, like, how different of a report would you be writing today than you did a few months back? Like, how much has he progressed as a prospect since?
I think it would be pretty significantly different. I think it's less about kind of the tools that have improved. I think it's more the confidence he's shown and kind of the way that he's taken over as well. Like, you look back to where he really kind of started to find his groove last year in the back half of the season with London and into the playoffs. You kind of look at that roster and, like, yes, he's performing well. It's good for what he was doing, but I think you look at the season as a whole, screams kind of second rounder. What really is his upside as kind of this energy guy? probably third line or something like that. And on that nice roster where you have some older talent that is kind of leading the way in that regard, it's something where he's not the driver on that top line. And yes, he was playing a big role on a team that went to the OHL finals and all that stuff. And that's why he ended up being a first rounder. That's why he was a riser come the end of the season. I still thought he was somebody that would go in the second round because he's not that big. He was more of a winger at the end of the year. And while he has a lot of intriguing tools, it was something that kind of projected more into a bottom six role. And what I've seen from him this year is where he's taken over and kind of been that key driver on a line. He's played with confidence, and it's something where he's shown that versatility to play center if you need him to, play left wing if you need him to, play right wing if you need him to be a very good power play guy if you need him to, but also kind of what he's shown shorthanded. He's played so well in all these positions. It's something where at the end of last season, it's like, okay, there's something here, but what is the upside of it? Kind of projecting to that bottom six role based off of not a huge guy, plays with pace, but does he have kind of the scoring upside to play higher in the lineup? And what we've seen from him this year is kind of taking that next step, playing with that confidence, driving lines, playing with pace, and being able to put the puck in the back of the net, both with some impressive skating and shiftiness and playmaking, but also showing off an impressive shot as well. So it's something where at the end of last season, I just looking back on it, it's probably something where people should have been higher on him just based off of what he did in the playoffs on a top team with London. And he maybe didn't get enough credit for how well he was playing on that team, playing in a big role for Dale Hunter and all that stuff. But I think it's also something where you got to give credit to the player as well for putting in work over the summer and his development this year as well. He's an exceptionally hard worker, and you can see that in both his game, but you also see it off the ice in the way that he kind of carries himself and trains and things like that. So for Easton Cowan, yeah, I think looking back, I think most people would agree, obviously, like he should have been a kind of consensus, more of a first round guy, and maybe was being overlooked a little bit with some of his strengths and weaknesses and stuff like that. But I think at the same time, you have to give credit to what the player has done to this point to kind of prove the Maple Leaf staff as well in what they saw in the player, saw in the person as well, which I think is something that goes a little bit overlooked in the draft process as well, where sure, you're drafting the talent and the player at 17, 18 years old. You're also drafting the player and the person in terms of how you can see them developing, taking in that information, implementing that information into their game. And clearly so far over the past 6-7 months, Easton Cowan's somebody that has shown to be a sponge in terms of taking in that development, working on his game, and excelling with some of the new information that he's gotten. So yeah, you talk about that difference in scouting reports since June, and it certainly changed in that regard. And I'd say that the key points is just the confidence that he's playing with and the ability to drive a line, which I don't think people necessarily saw back in June. I think they saw him more as kind of a complementary piece and somebody that ultimately projected as a third, fourth liner. And clearly the way he's playing right now, it's easy to see him playing higher up in a lineup come his professional days.
We'll get back to our chat with Kyle in just a moment, but first I want to tell you about one of today's sponsors, and it is Game Time. You shouldn't have to worry about when you're buying tickets to the next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from receipt, and their best price guarantee. Game Time will take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Game Time is the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind when you make your purchase. You can see the view from your seat before you buy it, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Game Time has deals on tickets right up until the start of the event, and even an hour after it starts. It's the place to find last-minute seats. You can find exclusive flash deals and sponsored deals on tickets for football, hockey, basketball, baseball, whatever event you are trying to go to. And the Game Time guarantee means that you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Could be a good gift idea for the holidays coming up. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Today's show is also brought to you by FanDuel. As the weather gets colder, the NFL offers stay hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. So if you're a Bills fan, you bet for them to win on the money line this weekend, bam, $150 for that money line victory. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season right. FanDuel, the official partner of the Locked On Sports Network. Kyle Cushman, prospect analyst and hockey writer from The Score, joining us here on the Locked On Leafs podcast. So those are the top two prospects that the Maple Leafs have. I don't believe there's anyone else who's expected to be on any of these other rosters. You can fill me in.
That's
if
correct.
I'm,
Yeah,
yeah.
all of it's kind of funny where I mentioned a little bit earlier where for a few years there it was like the Leafs had nobody eligible for Canada and a bunch of guys eligible for either the States or European countries. It's flipped over the past couple of years where everybody eligible in the Leaf system for the World Juniors, all of them are Canadian actually. So there's nobody even eligible to play for the States or Sweden or Finland or anything like that. Everybody under 20 in the Maple Leaf system is Canadian, which is a bit of a change over recent years.
Well, I'm curious. So there's one prospect though who will not be there for obvious reasons, but I keep hearing the name like Nikita Grebyonkin. Like if Russia were to have sent a team, which they're not, they're banned for however long they are for. Is he a player that you think would probably be at this tournament? And what have you made of his development over the last year and a half?
Yeah, so Nikita Grebyonkin was actually drafted as an overager, so he would have been eligible to play last year's World Juniors. He's too old to play it this year. So despite being drafted 2 drafts ago now, he's actually a year older than the cycle, so would be too old to play this year, would have been a key player on Russia last year. And yeah, he's somebody that kind of exploded last year, where was drafted as an overager out of the Russian Junior League, which is a league where there's a lot of variance. You can put up a lot of points in that league and not be very good even in the KHL, let alone the NHL. But what Grebyonkin's done is kind of found a niche for himself last season, getting a loan to a bit of a worse KHL team and putting up some points in the top 6 on that team and actually won KHL Rookie of the Year last year. And so he's kind of taken that momentum, has returned back to his parent club, Metalurg Magnitogorsk, who is one of the top teams in the KHL. And it's been a bit of an up and down season for him. He's played a little bit in the bottom 6. He's also played a few games on the top line and stuff like that. And so overall, I'd say it's been a good season for Grebyonkin, kind of building on what he showed last year. I think the big part for him was kind of solidifying his spot in the lineup on a top team in the KHL. He's done that for sure. He's played basically every single game all season long. He's a fixture in their lineup now, and he's put up a handful of points. He's not a power play 1 guy or anything like that on that team, but he's a winger who has a good frame. He's listed at 6'1" or 6'2". He's a little bit lanky. So he's not one of these like super small, skilled Russian guys that everyone maligns that the Maple Leafs take. He's got some size to him. He can add a bit more to his frame and kind of change up his skating stance a little bit to kind of take contact and pressure a little bit more. But he's somebody that is a really, really solid playmaker, especially pulling pucks along the boards and kind of feeding slot chances and kind of working around the net. He's somebody that, is kind of slowly finding his game. He was somebody that last year was actually mentioned by Kyle Dubas as one of those guys in the Maple Leafs mix that they're keeping an eye on as some of their top prospects. And he's not somebody that is quite on the Maple Leafs radar yet to kind of jump over and make the NHL right away. But I think in a couple years' time, he's somebody that's going to gain more and more traction as he continues in the KHL, eventually comes to the AHL. And he's somebody that has a lot of intriguing tools as kind of a shifty offensive winger who has some size to him at 6'2" and does a lot of good work along the boards and digging pucks out and stuff like that. So he's definitely a player that I've grown a lot on over the past couple of years and somebody that I quite like in the system. He's easily inside my top 10 for Maple Leafs prospects.
Yeah, maybe a nice little diamond in the rough, perhaps.
Go ahead. I think that's a great way to put it. When you talk about a mid-round pick and an overage player drafted,
they need that. They don't have many of those mid-rounders who flourish. So
exactly that. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, those kind of diamond in the rough guys where you look and he's kind of drafted out of a weird spot, mid rounds, kind of a flyer, and he's definitely popped in a quick way. And if you were to redraft that draft, you would go quite a bit higher than the 5th round or wherever he was actually taken.
Now, when you look at the Leafs prospect system as a general, like it doesn't get the highest rating. Obviously, they haven't had a lot of high picks. They haven't had a lot of picks in general the last few years. But when you're looking at this team's where this team is right now and having to make moves to help the main club right now, and sometimes you don't have the picks, so prospects have to be included. Who do you think is a prospect that teams are going to, when they're looking at the Leaf system, this is a guy that those teams are going to target?
So obviously the guys that they're going to try to target are the top guys, the Mintens, the Cowans. Those guys are going to be off the table. Like I would be shocked if there's any move that the Leafs would make that would include those couple of guys. Just because we don't really see teams need to give up those kind of premier prospects in their systems in any of the trades that we've seen over the past couple of years. Like the big one that you think back to is a Timo Meier type trade, and they gave up Shakir Mukhamadullin, who's a good defense prospect. He put up some impressive numbers in the KHL, came over mid first round or stuff like that. He also wasn't the Devils' top prospect at the time of the trade. You look at Alexander Holtz being kind of the marquee guy and stuff like that. So in certain kind of trades, you could see those guys' names coming up. But I can't see either of them being moved. They're probably in kind of that Robertson Nyes tier over the past couple of years where they're kind of the non-starters on the prospect side, and we'll kind of look to some other guys. So the guys in the prospect system that I look at, the two that kind of jump out to me immediately are Nick Abruzzese and Alex Steeves, where they're two guys that are knocking on the door of the NHL. So if you're making a trade with a team like Calgary at the deadline or something like that, they're two guys that, even though they're playing in the AHL for the Maple Leafs right now, could probably step into an NHL lineup and play some kind of role. What that kind of differs depending on the player. Nick Abruzzese is a lot more of a kind of typical smaller offensive winger who's a fantastic playmaker, actually played quite a bit with Matt Coronado in college. So that could be a guy that you maybe look to in a Calgary trade. He hasn't had maybe quite the start to the season that he was hoping for in terms of the points, but he's still been really solid in terms of creating chances and things like that with the Marlies. So might not have kind of the premier trade value that you would hope for, but he's a player that I think teams might like depending on what their situation is. Alex Steeves is a guy that is a little bit younger than Nick Abruzzese, actually, just kind of an awkward one where Abruzzese was drafted as a double overager. Steeves is an undrafted guy, but kind of similar in their development curve where Alex Steeves has been exceptional this year with the Marlies, has had a double-digit game point streak, has kind of taken his game to the next level in terms of driving play, zone entries, controlling the puck through the neutral zone, and kind of converting that into points as well. I just kind of look at him as a guy that probably tops out as like a good fourth liner, maybe chips in on your third line, plays a little bit on the penalty kill, won't play really on your power play. And that has value to an extent for the Maple Leafs, but also when you look at his AHL numbers, might be somebody that fits more in a trade as well. So those are two guys on kind of the verge of the NHL that would make sense as maybe a trade chip in a deal where somebody on the verge of the NHL, you can get them in the NHL upon a trade, and something that kind of fits both getting a roster player and also a young player for a receiving team in kind of a deadline deal. You kind of look elsewhere than that, and there aren't too many options when you look kind of at the system right now, just because of the lack of picks that they've had. There aren't a lot of guys that are kind of in that B tier that the Maple Leafs have, that are kind of in that second tier and kind of easily identified as trade chips. You kind of look at Abruzzese and Steeves as those kind of guys, but on defense, somebody like a Topi Niemela, I would be very surprised if they move him just because of the lack of defense prospects that they have. Could somebody like a Mikko Kokkonen move after an impressive training camp, but kind of still a middling season with the Marlies? That's an option, but I'm not really sure how much value he would have around the league. And so kind of look to the unsigned guys, and it's a lot of the same. So there's not too many guys in that second tier that I really see. I think if the Leafs are making a trade, it would probably be one of Abruzzese or Steeves as kind of that prospect / young roster player. And then maybe
like I don't know if that gets the Leafs what they're looking for. Like
no. I mean, what I was about to say there is that I think it's more based around draft picks. I don't think the Leafs really have that kind of the
Which they
depth in the
also don't have
prospect
many
pool.
of.
They don't have a lot of, but they have enough in the higher tier that they could get kind of the Chris Tanev type or one of those kind of guys. So yeah, you look at the system and like, especially if like you're not moving Cowan, you're not moving Minten, you're probably not moving Niemela. Like there's not a lot in the system where you kind of rule out some of those top guys that you want to keep because they're going to impact your roster in a year, maybe two. There's not a lot of those kind of second tier guys, unless there's a team that particularly likes what Mikko Kokkonen brings, unless there's a team that particularly likes the offensive upside of William Villeneuve, unless there's a team that particularly likes what Nick Moldenhauer is and what maybe see him developing into a better player than what he's kind of shown this year at Michigan. So it's not like there's kind of that clear cut second tier guy. Like I think back to the Jake Muzzin trade. Like there's not clearly a Carl Grundstrom or a Sean Dursey in the system where they're clearly B tier prospects that are also in excess of what the Maple Leafs have, and you feel good about moving them in addition to a pick or something like that. I think these trades are going to be similar to what we saw last year, what if they do make them / when they make them, where it's going to be built more around the draft pick capital rather than the prospect capital.
One other prospect that I think it has impressed me so far, at least with the numbers. So maybe someone who has laid eyes on him personally can probably tell me a little bit more about the season he's having and if it's for real or not. But the whole 6'7", 230 pounds of Dennis Hildeby is putting up some rock star numbers right now in the American League. A 163 goals against, a 935 save percentage. Coming into today, I'm not sure if he started the game that they had just played tonight or not, but that was the number going into today at least. Is this for real? Is Dennis Hildeby a legitimately like maybe NHL caliber goalie prospect that the Leafs have here?
I think so. I think what he's shown to this point in his kind of brief tenure with the Maple Leafs, he's not NHL ready yet by any means, but he's on that trajectory where played last year more of a role in Sweden and put up very solid numbers. Was one of the best kind of U21, U22 goalies in the league. Played a legit back and forth 1A, 1B role, actually with Matt Tompkins, who got some starts this year with the Lightning, and put up good numbers there. Has come over to the AHL and has put up good numbers here. He had hip surgery a couple years ago before kind of his breakout season when the Maple Leafs drafted him. And since then, all he's done is stop pucks. Like you can look at his numbers over the past couple of seasons, and it's really, really impressive what he's done at kind of the Swedish U20 level, the SHL, and now the AHL. He did start today's game. He's down to a 925% save percentage. As terrible as that is. But no, like everything you look about at this guy like screams NHL goaltender. Where you look at the size, 6'7", 220, 230 pounds. Like he's got legit size to stop pucks. He's athletic, can make some quick movements in the net, can also play a kind of a quieter, calm game. And I think that's more of what the style that will bring him success just because of his size. And since he's come into the Maple Leafs organization, like I mentioned, all he's done is put up rock star numbers. And obviously the kind of the smaller sample size of 9 games and what he's done, that'll come back down a little bit to earth. But he's also a little bit older than you would expect for being a 2022 draft pick. Like he's already 22 years old. Like he's on kind of this accelerated timeline just based off of how old he was when he was drafted. And it doesn't take a mathematician to look at his save percentage versus Martin Jones and Keith Petruzzelli's. Martin Jones, obviously a longtime NHL goaltender, and Keith Petruzzelli, somebody that was the Marley starter last year for the most part, and see the difference in those numbers and see that there's something here in Hildeby. So I'm not sure quite when the NHL trajectory will be for him. I think I need to see a little bit more of whether he can play kind of that starter's role this season in the AHL, build on that, kind of see what he can do on kind of the whole this year in the AHL. But yeah, he's somebody that has quickly rocketed up kind of in the prospect sphere, where he was undrafted for 3 years and then all of a sudden became a 4th round pick by the Maple Leafs after an impressive small sample season in the U20 league over there in Sweden. And after a great season in the SHL last year, a great start to this season, has quickly become one of kind of the rising goaltending prospects in all of the NHL.
Today's episode is also brought to you by Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Find top talent fast with Indeed's suite of powerful hiring tools like Indeed Instant Match assessments and virtual interviews. Hate waiting. Indeed US data shows over 80% of Indeed employers find quality candidates whose resume on Indeed match your job description the moment they sponsor a job. Candidates you invite to apply through Instant Match are 3 times more likely to apply to your job than candidates who only see it on search, according to US Indeed data. Indeed does the hard work for you. Sponsor job, and boom, Instant Match shows your candidates whose resumes on Indeed fit your job description immediately after you post. With Instant Match, you can start hiring fast. Join over 3 million businesses worldwide using Indeed to hire great talent fast. Indeed knows when you're growing your business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/locked-on to start hiring now. Indeed.com/locked-on. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed.
You're listening to the Locked On Leafs podcast. I'm Mike DiStefano with Dave Morassutti. We're chatting with Kyle Cushman, a prospect analyst and hockey writer at The Score. Let's transition a little bit into the big club, the parent club, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and it's been an interesting season, to say the least, for Toronto. Like, where would you assess where the Leafs are at so far at this point in the year?
Yeah, the Maple Leafs at this point of the year are a team that have done enough to be in a solid position in the standings, but I think have given a lot left to be desired in terms of how they've gotten there, whether it be kind of the lack of regulation wins and kind of playing teams close and needing to go to overtime or shootout to kind of pull out those extra points, whether it be some of the underlying numbers or some of the kind of chemistry that has and then hasn't been this season. Like, the Leafs are in a solid position in the standings. Like, you look at points percentage, they're still well in a playoff spot, like all that stuff. Like, yes, there's some teams coming up in the Atlantic. There's also some teams falling off in the Atlantic, and the Leafs are kind of where they always have been this time of year in the Keefe era. But it's kind of the concern over how it's gotten to this point. Like, yeah, Nylander's been great, but Matthews and Marner have been kind of off and on this season. You look at the bottom 6, and Ryan Reeves has been Ryan Reeves, and what is the fourth line actually going to do? And then the third line, when it scores, has been fun, but when it doesn't score, has no kind of purpose as well. And then on defense, it's been just an absolute tire fire of injuries and John Klingberg being a disaster of an experiment and like all this stuff. And it's like, sure, they're in a good spot in the standings, but does anyone feel like amazing about this team right now? Like, I would be surprised if you find anyone that's like, oh yeah, the Leafs are in a fantastic spot right now. And that's just a reality of the way that they've played, kind of the lack of kind of dominant wins that they've had, just with the lack of regulation wins, and kind of what has been largely an experimental season where you've seen a lot of mixing and matching and not really a lot of set lines or set pairs. Like, we've kind of had it over the last little bit. It's obviously changed with Mitch Marner and William Nylander kind of swapping for a game or two there. But this last little stretch has kind of gotten a little bit more of that lineup, same night in, night out, but it hasn't been something where it's like, yep, this is going to be kind of line 1, line 2, line 3 come playoff time. Like, there's a lot of mixing and matching, figuring out where to make additions, where you're good enough in the system to kind of leave it as is come playoff time. Like, can Max Domi be a center for you on your third line, driving kind of offense in your bottom 6 come playoff time? He did it last year to an extent with Dallas, but has it worked well enough this year with the Leafs? I'm not convinced yet. Like, is Matt Nye somebody that can play on your top line come playoff time and be kind of somebody that works with Matthews and Marner? It worked for a game or two at the start there. It hasn't necessarily worked as much the last few games. So there's a lot still to be kind of desired in this Maple Leafs lineup. I think there's been some bright spots, like Noah Gregor's been great on the fourth line when he's kind of had some guys to work with. He's shown that speed. It's been a difference maker. That's something that can pot you an extra goal in the playoffs that can make a difference. He's been a good penalty killer as well. You got to figure out what you're going to do on the fourth line when it comes to Ryan Reeves, whether you need to make an addition there, whether you need to give somebody like a Bobby McMahon more of a chance. Like I mentioned, Alex Steves, when he comes back, he's currently out with an injury. When he comes back, is that somebody that gets a shot in the fourth line? So there's still a lot of questions to be answered. And I think at this point of the season, I think a lot of people were hoping that some of those questions would be answered come this time. Like, I think the only thing that we've really seen so far is that Bertuzzi can work in the top six after kind of a bit of a lackluster start in the top line. He's worked pretty well with Tavares and Nylander, especially those couple of Sweden games where that line was absolutely clicking. So other than that, like Max Domi's still a bit of a question mark. Matt Nyes, Nick Robertson, we don't really know where they're going to slot in on defense. Everything's basically a question mark because of the injuries and the lack of consistency in the lineup, and guys like William Lagesson playing top 4 minutes sometimes, guys like Tanner Timmins having to play top 4 minutes sometimes. Like there's a lot still to be answered for this team. So as it stands right now, sure, they're in a good enough spot in the standings and there's no alarms or panic button being hit. But there's still a lot to kind of figure out with this team over these next couple of months. And the trade deadline comes up on you quick as well, especially once the holiday season wraps up.
So I want to know, because I've been asked this a few times, so I figure I want to get the chance to ask someone this. If you were the Leafs, do you go for a top 3 spot in the Atlantic, or would you prefer to go in as a wild card team? Because right now, that's where they find themselves.
Wild card is scary just because like that's playing with fire a little bit, especially with how close it is, and especially if you kind of match up against like a Rangers team or a Boston team at kind of the top of those divisions. So I think the goal always has to be to kind of solidify as best of a position as you can get, try and get that home ice advantage, whether it be second in there. Obviously it feels, which is crazy to say already, that first in the division is kind of out of reach, which was a goal coming into the season, but Boston hasn't lost a step, which is insane to say, given they lost their 2 top centers to retirement over the summer and they still find a way. But yeah, for the Maple Leafs, I think you got to still gun for that number 2 in the division if you can't get number 1, just because of what home ice gives you, avoiding kind of the uncertainty of that wild card position affords you, and ultimately being second in the division means that they're playing better hockey going into the playoffs as well. So you can kind of nitpick over what matchups are best for the Maple Leafs and stuff like that. They've also blown it in the past against teams against the Habs, and also played well against other teams that you wouldn't maybe expect as well. So honestly, given how things have gone in the past, I've given up on trying to be the matchmaker for the Maple Leafs come playoffs and stuff. I think it's just about playing your best hockey, worrying less about the potential matchup of being second, third, fourth into the division, crossover, wild card, that kind of stuff. Just focusing on yourself and being the best team you can come playoff time.
Yeah, I don't think it really matters. Like, I mean, you look at them, and there was the "we want Florida" chance last year, and well, look how that turned out. So it's not like
exactly
you want to
right. Like there you go.
say, "Oh, we want the Rangers, we want the crossover." Like, well, the Rangers are a pretty darn good team too. So
I don't want to play Igor Shesterkin ever in a playoff series. No, thank you.
You really don't. So I'm with you, man. I think that you absolutely I don't think first place is out of the reach, by the way. Like I'm 9 points up, but they got 2 games in hand.
Yeah.
Say they win those couple of games, all of a sudden, okay, there's 5 points, and I believe there's still a game or 2 between them and Boston to try and close it to a little bit. And you got to think that they're going to hit a skid at some point, the Bruins. And like you said,
you think, right?
You would think.
They had a mini skid.
They did lose 3 straight there where they gave up like 5 goals in each game.
Oh man, I don't know if you saw the McAvoy quotes after that, but he was acting like it was some 6-game losing streak, and he was like, "I forgot how to lose." I was like, "This is the most insufferable team of all time."
I know.
Like,
it was. It's insane. They've gone on to win 3 straight since then.
Yeah, exactly. Because of course they did.
Because they're Boston. But I mean, like you said, Toronto, they're not at their best right now, but they're still like playing at in a playoff rate. What are they, a 600 win percentage team right now? 636 win percentage or points percentage, and they're maybe 75% to what they should be, what they could be.
That's the exciting part, right? Like they haven't played up to their potential. There's been a lot of question marks in the lineup, and they're still in that position.
You look at how this team is built, right? Like so they're a 636 win percentage the way that they've played, and this team is built with star power for Matthews, Marner, Tavares, and Willie all going and playing, at an elite level. Well, you've gotten good play out of Willie, you've gotten good play out of Tavares, but those other two, like they're going to wake up at some point. And when that happens, the Leafs are going to go on a run and they're going to put up some points. And I think that's when you can really say, okay, this team should be able to get back within the driver's seat in this Atlantic division. I don't think it's done yet. I think the Leafs have much better hockey to come in the future.
Yeah, and if they can parlay that into kind of a dogfight for first in the division come the end of the season, like I think playing for that meaningful title of finally winning an Atlantic Division crown, like that'll put you in a good spot going to the playoffs as well. If you can go out and either get that crown or just having those meaningful games at the end of the regular season, where so often it's been meaningless regular season games for the final 2 months of the season for the Maple Leafs over the past couple of years. Playing those meaningful games for meaningful points in the standings, I think that would be a real boost as well. So yeah, like you mentioned, like Matthews and Marner, like they've been good to an extent, but they haven't been dominant yet.
No, and that, like they're
And
putting
when
up
they find that,
they're putting up points, but they have not played their best. Which again, a glass half
they haven't
full.
tilted the ice like the way that they can.
No, absolutely not. And I think they'll get back to playing together and they'll get back to playing the way that they know how to. I think we've seen Marner over the last week or so start to finally get back to his game. You know, there was the fishbowl game where it was like, okay, that's the Marner that we know
Yeah.
is an all-pro level. Matthews coming off this game against Boston, he finally got back in onto the score sheet with a couple of goals. So I'm curious now going forward, like, was this week maybe the turning point for the Leafs, where now going forward up until Christmas, they can rattle off some wins here and really try and get creep closer and closer to Boston. Again, they've got a couple games in hand where they can try and pick up some points here as well.
Yeah, and like I think the best way to look at it is like you saw the happy feet from Marner during the shootout attempt.
Yeah.
That's the Marner that we want to see night in,
Yes.
night out. That's when he's playing at his best. When he's playing with confidence, when he's
Yes.
shifty like that, like that's the Mitch Marner that is the $11 million player.
Yeah,
So
and
when we see more of
Matthews,
that,
even Matthews, like you look at the way, even on that game-winning goal, the way that he was able to kind of weave in and out of traffic, getting himself open and in a position to shoot the puck, like that's what you need to see. Where when his feet aren't moving and he's kind of stagnant, he's easy to defend, but when he's moving around the ice and he's finding those soft pockets, that's when Matthews is at his best with that one timer. So, I think it's starting to come around. Definitely some good stuff. Hopefully that's the case at least. I mean, they could go out and have stinkers because I feel like I've said it a couple of times this year. It's like, oh, Marner back-to-back 4-point games. Is he back? And then he followed up with like 6 or 7 meh games, but hopefully this truly is the turnaround that the Leafs need. I know Shanahan said the last 5 to 10 games have been playing a little bit better. Hopefully they can get healthy after Christmas defensively. Maybe they make a trade to bring in and help that blue line. Looks like Joe Wall is starting to kind of turn things around, or stabilize the net, I guess is a better way to put it. So things are definitely looking up, I think, for the Maple Leafs. Kyle, really appreciate taking the time to join us. It was a fun chat, and I know we'll do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Always a fun time when World Junior camps come out, and means exciting times ahead, of course, with the hockey calendar getting closer and closer to playoff time. World Junior talk, of course, on Boxing Day, trade deadline stuff, all heating up. It's always a fun time when it clicks over to December and we get a little bit of that World Junior talk.
Let our listeners know where they can find your work.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Kyle_Cush, CUSH there. And all my writing essentially is on the Score. So going to have a lot of stuff coming up in advance of the World Juniors. Going to have a lot of great content there. Some Maple Leaf stuff involved in there as well. Leading up until, of course, the big day on Boxing Day when the tournament gets underway. A little bit of a different tournament this year. We've been so used to it during the Canada time zones and getting those night games. It's going to be some of those morning, mid-afternoon games with it back over in Sweden. So a bit more of that kind of classic European World Junior vibe to it. And it's going to be a fun tournament as well, with hopefully a couple of Maple Leafs prospects on the roster for Canada as well, which is something that we haven't had in a handful of years as well. When we've had Maple Leafs prospects to follow for the World Juniors, it's typically been some of the more European teams over the past couple of years. So that's going to be exciting there. And so, yeah, you're going to find all of that coverage over on the Score. So make sure to download that and follow along in the NHL feed, and follow along with Team Canada and whatever other countries you want to follow with for the World Juniors there as well. And also want to give a quick shout out to the PWHL as well, which is rapidly coming up, I should say. Scrimmages and stuff happening right now in Utica during the preseason. Been getting out to a few of the PWHL Toronto practices the last couple weeks.
Nice.
Very, very exciting time there with some of the top women's players finally having this kind of marquee league to play in with a lot of momentum behind it. That gets underway at the start of January, and very excited to be covering that team this year a little bit for the Score, and also kind of personally as well, which you can find those updates on Twitter as well at Kyle_Cush.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to get you on too. Definitely, probably
Yeah,
right
for sure.
after the New Year. We'll do some more prospect talk, see how you felt of the World Juniors, and right after New Year's, I guess PWHL will be. We'll finally
Literally New
get that
Year's
started.
Day,
So,
Toronto,
yeah,
New York, getting it started at
Madame.
the old Maple Leaf Gardens. Yeah, Mattamy
Yeah.
Athletic Center. It's going to be a fun one.
Yeah, definitely will. Appreciate it, Kyle. And that'll do it for us here on the podcast today. I'd like to thank you all for listening and supporting the show. You can subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast on all podcasts and platforms and receive daily Leafs content. Follow myself on X at Mickey_Canuck. Follow Dave at D_Morassutti. And once again, follow Kyle at Kyle_Cush. If you enjoyed the content today, we ask that you do leave a like on this video, leave a comment down below if you're here on YouTube as well. That'd be greatly appreciated. We'll be back with another episode for you guys tomorrow. Leafs in action, taking on the Ottawa Senators. We'll preview that one for you guys tomorrow. Until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.